Adriana said she'd be coming in later too. Okay. Myself untangled. Hopefully the sound will work. Haven't tested. So where are we at? Class 6. No, this is class 7, isn't it? Yes, but it is dissemination implementation. Just didn't change the number. So there's more patient engagement updates. So we're still like 2 classes back with that, but I've been continuing to meet with patient engagement people. So I thought that you'd be interested to hear what more we know about patient engagement, especially locally. A little bit of review for knowledge translation, and then we're going to talk about dissemination of what. Is this the same as KT? Is it part of KT? Implementation, what is it? Again, is it the same as KT? And as you wade into this terminology in these fields, we'll see that it's all KT, some way or another. So let's go back to patient engagement. It's defined as meaningful and active collaboration in governments, priority setting, conducting research, and knowledge translation. So patient-oriented research, which we're all attempting to do, is a continuum of research that engages patients as partners, focuses on patient-identified priorities, and improves patient outcomes. And it's typically conducted by multidisciplinary teams in partnership with relevant stakeholders, including the patients. The idea is to apply the knowledge generated to improve healthcare systems and practices. So I was at Grand Rounds today. One of the breast surgeons was presenting this new type of research, you know, where you looked at these patient-reported outcomes, and it's like, we never thought we could actually ask the patient, you know, and consider that data. So I'm like, hello, psychologists, we've been doing this for like 40, 50 years, like we actually invented it, you know. So they're all excited about this new thing, and they're like, we're doing patient engagement. We're like asking people questions about what their priorities are in healthcare. I'm like, golly gee whiz, you know. But so it is filtering down to kind of more mainstream research. I'm going to just fix the light so it's not so bright. Which is the single one? That's one on. There you go. So it's not that we've been doing that sort of patient engagement that much either, but we've certainly been doing patient-reported outcomes, you know, self-report measures forever. So this is just another version of that same IAP2 spectrum of researcher engagement or patient engagement, from, you know, the level of just informing patients to actually collaborating and allowing them to lead. And this one is, I like this one because it's also got how this can be done, so specific examples of the type of methodologies. So if you recall, you know, we are definitely consulting. They're participating, so anybody who fills out a survey for you is a participant, right? As well as consulting them and involving them directly and working towards collaborating. So partnering equally with the patients as team members. So that means the patients are co-investigators, they're research partners, they're members of your research planning and steering committees. So that's what I'm aiming for, and so I had some more meetings since last time we met with the patient engagement people from Alberta Health Services and Cancer Control Alberta, which is a subgroup of AHS, but historically independent because we used to be Alberta Cancer Board, which was completely separate from Alberta Health Services, which used to be the different health authorities, so Calgary Regional Health Authority. So when everything was amalgamated, they took cancer control, but then they gave it back because they realized everything was different in cancer control. So now they call it Cancer Control Alberta, Alberta Health Services, and the patient engagement piece is no different. They have similar parallel organizations and staffing for doing that. So through AHS, last time I talked about, hey, come on in, just kind of reviewing stuff, so you're good. I'm giving you a little bit more of an update on patient engagement because I've had another couple of meetings. So specifically talking about what resources are at Alberta Health Services and through Cancer Control Alberta. So last time I had shown you briefly the AHS patient engagement manual and stuff, which was very generic, kind of. But it turns out they do have a patient and family registry, and they've got several hundred people on the registry, and we can apply directly to this registry for a patient partner for your research projects. So I'll review that a little bit. And Cancer Control Alberta has a similar group called Patient and Family Advisors, And they seem to take a bit more care with the people, and so they've taken them through the whole volunteer services onboarding, which means they do like a criminal records check, they do all the confidentiality training, and so they're official volunteers through Alberta Health Services or through Cancer Control Alberta. And in addition, they're trained in the role of being a patient advisor and what that means and what it would look like. So you can also apply to have access to these people, which I'll show you. And so there's a number of resources that I put on your D2L in the 2 sessions ago that was called Patient Engagement. So there's a guidebook on engaging advisors. And there's a manual for staff liaisons. So I figured out the staff liaison thing more too. It's not supposed to be the PI. A staff liaison is somebody like, I don't know, like a research coordinator or a postdoc or, you know, a sort of study leader or a research assistant or some kind of staff member who's not the PI, who is in charge of basically care and nurturing of your patient advisors. So there's a whole manual for staff liaisons, there's a checklist, and what I found interesting too was how to budget for patient engagement in your research grants, which was useful. So I'll show you those just briefly. So this comes from the, what's it called? The Guidebook on Engaging Advisors. And so this is a 5-step process to engage them. So first you have to decide that you're going to do it, and then you sort of get ready. So what kind of resources do you need in place? What's the advisor going to do exactly? And you have to write job descriptions and fill out all the application materials. So I'm actually just about to do that in the next little bit. And then you recruit the people. So the way that recruiting works through both agencies in slightly different ways is that you write out what you need, and then they give it to the advisors, and the advisors put up their hand and say, I want to do that project, right? So they don't find people for you. You basically say, this is what I want, and they just send it out to all the advisors on their list, and then the advisors can say yay or nay. So that's pretty cool. So you recruit, register, and do the orientation, and that's where your staff liaison comes into place. So there's all sorts of orientation things you want to do before your advisor even comes to your, your planning meeting or whatever it is you're having. You have to mentor and support them along the way. And again, the staff advisor, the staff liaison, is the person who kind of does this mostly. So building the relationships, establishing how and when you're going to communicate, giving them feedback, even things that are like very practical. So the staff liaison manual says, before the first meeting, meet the advisor, take them out for coffee, tell them what's going to happen, have them sit next to you at the meeting, like really very concrete things that are going to make it a better experience for the advisor, right? So it's actually quite helpful. And then you have to monitor your progress and results. Get feedback from the advisor and the other team members and all that. And this is like the little staff liaison checklist. There's like a, 50-page manual, but it gives you sort of things you need to do, right? So prepare your advisor for participation. So schedule, this is where it's going to list you. Schedule an interview coffee meeting for your first meeting, have them meet with the leaders. So this is Dr. So-and-so who's running the project, these are the people who are going to be involved. Work with your team to complete the request form. Be very clear about what it is you want the advisor for any engagement activity. So schedule some time, go over the agenda, answer questions. So just basically sort of, all the little things that the staff liaison needs to do to make sure the advisor feels like they're being heard and comfortable in a setting that's not always, sort of familiar to patients. So support and enable the advisor, attend all the meetings where the patient or family advisor is there, arrive with them, have them sit next to you during the meeting, listen for acronyms or concepts that require definition. And so do it for the advisor, say, hey, all these, CCA, AHS, all these acronyms we just use all the time, right? The advisor probably doesn't want to say, what does that mean, what does that mean? So the staff liaison does that for them, right? Say, could you please define this? Ensure the chair of the meeting is asking for the advisor's participation. So I think this is going to be really helpful because they also sort of provided some guidance on how to create an overall for within your research program. So this is something that like Nicole might want to do, like Nicole Coulos-Reed, right? Or what I'm going to do is that you actually put together an overarching patient engagement strategy, and maybe she's already done this, right? And it includes, like, they said that the overall committee should be half patients to half staff, right? And so
they would oversee all your projects, right? So not just the match study, but like the match study and the other studies that are in development and other ones where grants are going in, and you'd have this overall kind of patient engagement or whatever, your advisory committee, and they would, you could pull individual patients from this larger group. So say you've got 4 or 5 of them, right? You could say, okay, you want to help out with this project, you want to help out with that project, and so they would be sort of involved with your lab, you know, at a higher level. So they really see this as something that's not just a one-off thing, but so that's what we're going to do in my lab, and it'll be an experiment, right? Because I don't think anybody really does this, but I'm going to try and do it. Yeah.
Do you, or will you specify anything about the patient? So like
The people that you
got
want?
a study that's in a particular.
Well, so they basically identify themselves, right? So
Yeah.
I'll describe the studies or the area of research. So I'll say we study complementary therapies. You know, we're interested in mind-body therapies, natural health products, you know, interventions like acupuncture, Tai Chi, and communication, blah, blah, blah. And then just say, you might say certain things like, I don't know, what we really require, right? Other than that they've had an experience.
Just thinking if there's a specific tumor group or something.
If you wanted to, you could, right? If you're just studying breast cancer patients, then you'd want a breast cancer patient, right? I think for us it's more broad.
Yeah.
So I would probably take any type of cancer patient, but you can specify in your request. I think I have the sheet. I'll go over the budgeting, and then I think I may have a copy of, they have templates for the information they want, and then they send it out to the advisors or potential advisors. But this is interesting, the whole budgeting piece, right? Because we don't typically budget for this kind of stuff, but people who are funding research nowadays are expecting to see this in a way, like, and if you don't have that, you probably would be penalized. So you have to look at all the different expenses you might not think about, right? So compensating patients and reimbursing them for expenses. So they're saying that for the patient liaison role, this is the staff liaison, right? That you need staff, right? So you have to actually put an extra staff in your budget just to be the staff liaison, right? Like a 0.2 they're saying to start with, and then increase if there's more. So it could be somebody already in the team, like a postdoc is probably who I'll use. And budget for training and orientation for the patient partners. You have to pay them for their time, right? Removal of any barriers. So we would pay for caregivers or childcare, you know, printing costs, parking costs, hosting and hospitality. So you should expect that you're going to, you know, feed people and provide beverages, make it comfortable. You know, we don't often have to pay for meeting spaces and things like that. But fees, if you want patients to attend conferences, pay cash. That sounds good to me, right? And the patient compensation, so some kind of payment or honorarium, like an hourly wage, or, you know, I guess you'd have to look at what's standard. And then reimbursement for things like parking and mileage. Yeah, and then this idea of outside professional resources like facilitators, marketing people, and even like elders, counselors, support people. So if you're thinking in a broader sense of stakeholders, right? So this could add up quite a bit, right? And say, like for example, if I'm going to put together a kind of a panel, and the computer's going crazy today, a panel of people, say there's 4 or 5 patient advisors, and I expect them to come to say quarterly meetings or something like that, right? And you're going to pay them, I don't know, probably what you would pay a research assistant, you know, $30 an hour, $25, $30 an hour can add up. So, and again, you can put those in grants and people are expecting to see them. And there's more and more opportunities arising like the CIHR SCORE networks and stuff where that's specifically what they want to fund. And I don't think people apply for it because nobody knows how to do this stuff, right? They have no idea what they're talking about. I just, and again in this talk at lunch, the person was talking about the CIHR knowledge to action framework, right? And obviously wasn't very familiar with it and was, you know, talking about it in a way that showed that she didn't know very much about it. Right? Because everybody has to do it now. And so if you know more about it and you can do it in a way that shows you have knowledge, you're going to be way ahead of the game, right? Because now everybody's being forced to speak this language, but most of them don't know it. We're all just learning. So this is the specific AHS template. So for AHS, you write an invitation letter that goes directly to all the advisors. For Cancer Control Alberta, you fill out a form, but it's similar information. So you have to describe the project background, include a welcoming statement, provide an impact statement. So why is this research important? You know, how would they be impacted by it? Inspire involvement, but not coerce or mislead people. And then what are the patient requirements, right? So basically, what's the job description? So what experience should they have? You know, and you can be specific, right? Personal experience of breast cancer, family with breast cancer. Patients must have experience working on committees. You know, you may or may not want that, right? So how are they volunteering? What's their role going to be? Blah, blah, blah. Specify the time and resource commitment for the patients involved. Specify what will be compensated. Out-of-pocket expenses. So some of them don't expect to be paid, they just volunteer, but you should pay for any expenses that they incur. And talk about privacy, knowledge translation, and contact information. So that's all you have to provide. So it's fairly straightforward, and then you just sit back and wait to see who comes out of the woodwork. And then that's where your staff liaison gets involved and does more integrating of the patient, making sure they're appropriate and meeting with them and all that kind of stuff before they're even introduced to the team. Okay, so that was the update on patient engagement. Any comments or questions? So what I've done is put all the patient engagement stuff in that one lecture under patient engagement, even though it kind of stretched over 3 lectures as I was learning about all these different options. So next time I do it, it'll be like a much bigger patient engagement lecture. So we're going to go back to knowledge translation as a reminder to transition us into the dissemination implementation piece. So knowledge translation is basically everything, as we've come to learn, a dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge to improve the healthcare of Canadians, provide more effective health services and products, and strengthen the healthcare system. So here's our knowledge to action cycle that CIHR uses, although we know there's many, many different KT models, and I'm going to show you a whole other swack of them today. So you've got the knowledge funnel in the middle, where you can engage patients throughout the research endeavor, and then the knowledge product that pops out the bottom, your guidelines or whatever it is to address a certain problem, and then the outside is that sort of implementation or action cycle. And then this is within the sort of research endeavor. So this is sort of inside the knowledge funnel, all the different KT opportunities. So we reviewed this last time too. So there's an opportunity to help define research questions and methods, conducting the research for patients. 3 would be publishing in plain language and accessible formats. 4 is placing research findings in the context of other knowledge and norms. And then 5 is making decisions, taking action, so that application cycle, and then looking at the impacts and adjusting your research based on that. And so you remember that within research, there's integrated KT and end-of-grant KT. So integrated KT is a much more involved process that we're trying to do now by having these patient advisors early in the game. So it's a different way of doing research that applies the principles of knowledge translation to the entire process. The premise is that involving knowledge users as equal partners alongside researchers will lead to research that's more relevant and more useful to the new users. And each stage is an opportunity for collaboration with the knowledge users, so including the development or refinement of the research questions, the methodology, the data collection, the tools, outcome measures, basically A to Z for your research. Again, which is a very, I think, scary proposal for a lot of researchers, right? Because they think the patients are going to come in and get them all off track. You know, patients don't know how to do research, or you know, we've got this agenda where we're going to do mouse models of X, Y, Z, and the patients are just going to come in and they're not going to get it, and they're going to make us do all this crazy stuff that you know is relevant to them, which would be good, right? Anyway, end-of-grant KT. This is more what the dissemination piece is. So any activity aimed at diffusing, disseminating, or applying the results of a project. And methods range from simple communication activities to more intensive knowledge application efforts. End-of-grant KT activities should be more intensive and emphasize non-academic modes of communication when your knowledge users are not just researchers. And the language should obviously be adapted to target audiences. And there's lots of different ways you can share knowledge. So we talked about the knowledge broker thing last time and using emerging online technologies. And KT should actually draw upon evidence about what types of formats and messages are most effective. Okay, so this is sort of all review, right? So that's our KT thing. So, you know, I had sort of come up with the topics for these lectures based on what in my mind seemed like, you know, important activities. So we get to dissemination, and I'm like, well, what's dissemination anyway? Like, have we already done this? You know, where does it fit? I thought it's something different. So the best definition I could find is from this paper by Wilson in 2010, so that's also under D2L. And they say that diffusion, dissemination, implementation, knowledge transfer, knowledge mobilization, linkage and exchange, research into practice are all terminologies that describe very similar concepts. And so the idea of dissemination is a key element in the research to practice or the knowledge translation continuum. So the definition they use of dissemination, which I like, is that it's a smaller piece of knowledge translation, right? So it's a planned process that involves consideration of target audiences and the settings in which research findings are to be received, and where appropriate, communicating and interacting with wider policy and health service audiences in ways that will facilitate research uptake in decision-making process practice. So how is that different from KT, or is it? What do you think? Any of you? It's a lot of blah, 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 blah. Yep. So in my mind, I think dissemination is more honing in on just that, I don't know where it would be on the diagram, but just the communication. It's not integrated KT, right? I don't really think dissemination is about involving knowledge users or patients in the design of research. It's more the little piece, like end of grant KT, right? Where you've got finally a piece of knowledge, right? You're finding that, you know, patients should exercise throughout cancer treatment to make it more concrete, right? So the dissemination piece is just getting that message out to everybody who needs to know it in a way that they can understand it.
It's a take-home message. So.
Pardon me?
It's a take-home message.
Take-home message, yeah. Yeah, so, you know, dissemination can be the traditional routes, right, where we present our papers at conferences, we give talks, we publish them. Those are all forms of dissemination. But these days, the idea is that you want to be more broad, right, and use different types of language and target different audiences. And I think dissemination, which is why I put it before implementation, it is a step before implementation. Implementation is quite different. Whereas dissemination really is a piece of, we talk about that knowledge translation continuum, right? And if you think about integrated KT, which I think we should be, you know, you've got it happening right from the beginning of your research through designing and conducting your research, and then the dissemination piece is that bridge from the research to the practice when you come out kind of the bottom of your knowledge funnel. That's where you're disseminating, and then implementation is around the edges, right? Oh, so I think I have a video here. There we go. This lady's a little bit dull, but let's see if she works. Good to have a break from me, even if she's good though.
The Primary Healthcare Research and Information Service generates, manages and shares research, information and knowledge about Australian primary healthcare. Based on our experience in this area, here are some useful tips for you on spreading the word about your research. Before you begin to disseminate your research, it's worth taking a few steps to make sure you get it right. And it is best to do this before you even start your research and then review your plan regularly. So what is your message? Who's it for? Who and where should it come from? What are the best ways to communicate your message? Should it be oral, written, or both? And when would be the best time to do this? What do you want to happen from this dissemination? The message is the essential core of what's being communicated, and it will be interpreted in the light of how, when, where, and by whom it is communicated. So remember, it's not what the message does to the audience, but what the audience does with the message that determines the success of your dissemination. As such, it's important to know what you're communicating and to work out how best to present the message to specific audiences. Knowing and understanding your audience can be very useful. For tips on how to use language to communicate to different audiences, watch our presentation on plain language communication. After you've established your message and how to best translate it to your audience, consider who should be the best person to deliver the message. The advantage of a researcher presenting their own work is the extensive knowledge they have on the subject. However, some messages are best communicated through others, such as champions or experts on a particular topic, government representatives and knowledge brokers, or consumer advocates. When it comes to the format you present your work in, there are a number of dissemination methods, and each depends on topic, audience, and desired outcome. These might include an academic paper, a report, and remember to include an executive summary, a media release, a meeting, a presentation, and there may be others much more suitable. When it comes to the timing of your message, dissemination can occur before, during, and after the research process. Keep in mind, if people are aware of the research, they are more interested in the results. Before beginning your research, it's important to think about how you want it to be used, whether you want your work to be cited, downloaded, or used to inform policy or practice. Thoughtful dissemination throughout the research process will determine how it will ultimately be used. So in summary, dissemination is critical to research. Keep it simple, interesting, and relevant to your audience. Be diverse and opportunistic in your dissemination, and make sure you monitor your dissemination to determine its success.
So this actually, just watching this again, reminded me to give you some examples of how we've done this. So there's ways you can be kind of creative. Here, hold on a second. There's ways you can be creative around getting your message out to people, and I'm going to talk about social media and stuff like that next week. But like one example, where is it, that just came out? There it is. Oh, that's the wrong one. So we're doing a study right now on, actually this one just came out recently too, but I was going to show you a different one. This just came out April 27th, so just briefly, just shortly ago. So we're doing a study on acupuncture, right, on group acupuncture versus individual acupuncture. So this magazine, LEAP magazine, is put out by the Alberta Cancer Foundation on, I think a quarterly basis. And so we thought it would be good to help with recruitment and also just sort of dissemination, right? Get the word out, get people interested. And she said in the thing that people are going to be more interested in the results of your research if they know about it from the beginning, right? So this article, talks about the study we're doing, right? There's no results in it. It's just, is group acupuncture more effective than individual? It's got a picture of, that's me and the naturopath who's doing the acupuncture, and it just talks about the study. And so we're still recruiting for this study, and I just met with them before this, with her and the research assistant who's doing the recruitment, and she's like, we had forms that were in the clinics and stuff like that. She's like, we're not collecting forms anymore, but I had all these phone calls today, right? In the last couple of days, I've had all these phone calls, and I'm like, oh, the article came out. That's fine, right? So doing stuff like that is a really good idea, and if you can't, convince a journalist that they should write a story, you can pay people. So what we did with the match study for the first year is that I entered into a contract with an entity called Cancer Knowledge Network. And I'll show you. And what we did was, I think it was $3,000, so it wasn't a ton of money, but we wanted to get word out about the match study and maybe help with recruitment, but largely, again, just disseminating the fact that we're doing this, getting some excitement, getting some sort of buy-in and visibility for it. So we came up with this idea where every month we would write a blog about something related to the match study for a whole year. So we wrote 12 different blogs about the match study, and then the Cancer Knowledge Network, they have a mailing list of several thousand people who are patients as well as oncology providers, and they have a social media presence. Let's see, here it is, here, the match study. So they would send out tweets, they have emails that go out on a regular basis, and so everybody knows about the match study. So these are all the different blogs that we wrote. So it wasn't just about the study, but for example, last summer, the student who did the classes, he wrote my experience with mindfulness and Tai Chi, Qigong programs. This first one, you may be eligible, right? And then I wrote one, and we had different team members write them. So the Tai Chi guy wrote one, benefits of Tai Chi and Qigong. I wrote one on the benefits of other mind-body therapies, about the methodology of the match study, how it's a pragmatic real-world trial. How can it help with survivorship concerns? So we wrote a whole bunch of sort of different blog entries, and then CKN, with our group, a bunch of us are on Twitter and stuff like that, so they would
do newsletters, they would post Twitter things, and we would retweet them and stuff like that. And so we created a Twitter account for the match study. The match study has a Facebook account. And so just trying to do a lot of work to, sort of get the word out there. So it fits a lot with kind of what she's talking about in, who's your target audience, what kind of messages are going to fit with them. So that's, I guess, one good example of how we did that during studies, right? It's more typical to do it at the end. But I think it makes sense to start building excitement and energy about your studies even while they're just ongoing.
Linda, do you guys capture how patients are brought to you guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Deb is just doing it, right? So do we ask people?
Yeah.
Are we formally capturing that?
I only asked because I wanted to see how successful that thing
Well,
was,
I know,
right? Yeah.
right? Yeah, and we should. I think, honestly, that most people come through the targeted mail-outs we do anyway.
Okay.
And I wasn't really thinking it would be a recruitment tool so much as kind of a building awareness.
Okay.
Right, so that almost, because a lot of professionals are on the Cancer Knowledge Network mailing lists and stuff like that. So kind of getting visibility for the programs and the type of work we're doing and helping us in terms of our reputation, right, and being known as leaders in the field and, all those kind of things, right? It's not just about recruitment, it's about kind of staking your claim, It's like, we're doing this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then we do things like, and it's due actually, we write a letter. Yeah, the newsletters, we haven't written one for a year, right? The idea was to do it more frequently and to keep patients engaged, right? Because it's a long process. They have to come in 4 times and there's follow-ups. And so we want to keep the excitement level up, right? And keep people engaged. So things like patient participant newsletters and, keeping in contact with them. Yeah, and sort of updating them on anything that's happened is really important, right? So we tried to do more of that stuff in the recent studies. Yeah.
Did you have the initial links with those 2 examples already? Was there Cancer Knowledge Exchange in there?
Yeah, like with CKN?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had already known them because I had written some blogs for them. And so I just contacted them and I said, we want some way to promote this study. And sort of we came up with the idea together, like they hadn't really done such an intensive thing before, the idea of writing like value-added content, right? It's not just match study, match study, match study. It's, let's talk about Tai Chi, let's talk about mindfulness, let's talk about, so content that was actually meaty. And the idea of having something new every month, right? So that was kind of their idea, and I think it went quite well. I mean, certainly all my colleagues across the country, have heard about it. No, oh yeah, you're doing that match study. How's that going, right? So yeah, so it's kind of an interesting experiment. Okay, so if we look at what she emphasized there, is this idea of dissemination is really around the communication piece, right? But you want to look at, and she also mentioned too, I'm not sure if this is the same list as the list that was in the video. So beyond these things, so who does the message come from, right? I liked her, she was very diplomatic. The researcher might not be the best person to talk about their studies, right? Because researchers don't know how to talk to the general population, and they might be kind of boring and stiff, right? So sometimes it's better to have a participant in the study or a knowledge broker, right? Or, sort of somebody whose job is communications. And the channel, so, maybe it doesn't need to be written, maybe a video is better, right? There's all sorts of different ways, radio, television, whatever. And what's the message going to be, right? So that fits in with, well, what do you want to happen from this? What's the outcome of your dissemination that you want, and can you measure it, right? So if the message is exercise, you need to exercise while you go through cancer treatment, right? So you want to tailor that message and have it delivered to the audience who's supposed to do it, and then ideally find a way to measure it, right? So again, who's the audience you're trying to target? Is it policymakers? Is it patients? Is it clinicians? And you want to tailor the message and the setting that you deliver it, and all these things. So I put McGuire's 5 attributes because when I looked up sort of dissemination, this idea of persuasive communication as one of the predominant models of communicating comes up, and there's this guy named McGuire who's got these 5 attributes. So that comes up, and there's quite a bit of literature on that. So I'll go through a couple of other videos about, getting into implementation now. Let me see. And then there's all sorts of models too. Yeah, so really these things are so intertwined. I find when I sort of try and disentangle knowledge translation from dissemination, but I think we need to look at it as knowledge translation is the big umbrella, right? It's the whole model. You look at the dissemination is just the one little piece around the communication of your results or your activities, right? And then the idea of implementation takes it to the next step, okay? So you're disseminating the knowledge, but you're not going to change behavior unless you follow it through with a plan for implementation. So this video here talks to you about what they mean by implementation. There we go.
The evidence is clear. A healthy, active lifestyle is good for you. So, you've gone out and bought yourself a treadmill. You've wrestled it into your bedroom, and you've slid it under the bed, where it sits. It sits. You know you want to get into shape. You want to implement the treadmill as a catalyst or vehicle for improving your health. But unless you can corral the will, the motivation, support from friends, advice from your physician, agreement from your family to leave you alone while you walk or run, and all kinds of other factors, the treadmill will continue to produce dust bunnies. Just buying the treadmill won't make you healthier. You need a plan. And you need to implement and evaluate that plan. A simple dictionary definition describes implementation as the process of putting a decision or plan into effect. In our world, the decision or the plan generally relates to the process of introducing or integrating evidence-informed interventions or research findings into our day-to-day work. There's a very important word in there, process. Implementing evidence-informed practice is an active process, and it's a deliberate one. You can't snap your fingers, send an email, and sit back and wait for the magic to happen. But if you take the time to integrate some proven strategies, you'll set yourself up for success, both now and in the future. Successful implementation is about engaging stakeholders from across the organization in the process of strengthening, integrating, galvanizing. So the organization asks itself, what do we want to change and how can we get there? That opens up these questions as you explore the possibilities. Who can do it? Determining capacity and resources. How do we do it? Determining the nuts and bolts of the course of action. How do we train for it? Analyzing capacity and connecting people to knowledge. How will we evaluate it? Finding the right path for evaluation. And how will we capture our experience so we can share our knowledge with others? Finally, when these processes are in place, we implement the results in a sure-footed, measured way over time. Implementing evidence-informed practice depends on your ability to channel other forces too. Leadership, teamwork, managing the changes at the practical and cultural levels, mentorship, coaching, supervision, and support. And at the end of the day, investing in implementation means far more effective outcomes, and that translates to a higher level of organizational performance, a stronger commitment to being a learning organization, and, ultimately, better service to children, youth, and their families. It's worth the effort. Agencies that successfully implement a new evidence-informed practice come away with valuable skills in leadership, teamwork, evaluation, and change management they can keep using to strengthen their team and their services. And, as we've said, more than anything else, implementation means better outcomes for the people we serve. We want to help you to be successful, to stay inspired, and have access to all the skills necessary to master implementation. The Center offers a range of services to help you do just that. Through consultation, learning modules, and structured support programs, we can help you work through the implementation process from beginning to successful end.
Wow, great, sign me up. Taking the notes. There we go. So that sounds all good, right? Does it remind you of anything? Does it sound like anything else we've studied? Knowledge translation? I mean, basically, it's almost the same, right? In the other videos we've watched. Anyway, it sounds great. I love this video because it's like so inspiring. Yeah, let's do it. Let's implement something. But then it's like obviously not that simple, right? You know, so that made me think, okay, well, we need to figure out a bit more about how to actually do this stuff. So if you look at implementation resources and models,
there's like a million different models and frameworks around implementation. And I'm going to show you some of these. Actually, this one I think is a link to this article. Hold on a second. Oh yeah, that's right. There's another one too that's like mind-blowing. So this implementation science methodologies and frameworks, it's a PDF paper too that I have put on your D2L. Oops. Wait, what happened there? Here we go. So this model here is in that paper. It goes through a number of different models, but this is the sort of generic implementation model. So, you know, here you are pre-implementation, you have a thing, like let's use a concrete example. You want to, I don't know, say you want to get patients exercising at the hospital, right? That would probably be a really cool thing to do. And so then you have to look at this process of implementation where you have certain strategies you want to do, there's certain factors, it's all very vague, right? Some evaluations, there's context domains, I don't know, what does this one here say? Can you read it? You know, so this generic framework is just sort of illustrating that you have to look at these things that interact around one another, but it's not particularly useful in actually, I don't think, developing an implementation plan, right? So we need to look a little deeper at different resources and models. And there's a couple I'll just mention that are frequently applied, and then I'll show you the breadth of them because there's like a gazillion. Now, you remember when we went through all the knowledge translation models? Does anyone remember any of them? Well, I showed you one earlier today. The knowledge to action cycle. Yeah, so that's one of the knowledge translation models we went over. There was a number of other ones too. Well, the same thing in this area of implementation. The idea of, you know, getting an evidence-based, whatever it is, program, practice implemented. Also, there's many different ways people think about it. So RE-AIM stands for reach. So this framework is you have to look at the reach, an individual level measure of participation. So the percentage and risk characteristics of persons who receive or are affected by policy or program. So say we're implementing, again, exercise during cancer treatment. So the people you want to reach are all the patients who are undergoing cancer treatment. Effectiveness is the effectiveness of the intervention that you want to deliver, right? So the thing you want to deliver is, I don't know, 150 minutes of exercise a week. Well, we know it's very effective if people will do it. Adoption is the proportion and representativeness of settings that adopt a given policy or program. So you're thinking, okay, you know, we want to reach all the cancer patients. It's going to be effective if we can get them up to that level. What proportion of all the cancer patients or the cancer centers, if you're targeting the providers to do it, you know, what percentage are going to actually adopt it? So this is almost like you have a target and then you evaluate it. So it's an evaluation framework as well. And then you look at implementation. So this is in an evaluation context. The extent to which a program is delivered as intended. So you have an idea of who you want to reach, you know, what actually happened. And then maintenance measures the extent to which innovations become stable and are sustained. So that's the RE-AIM framework. And the other one that's quite common is this pre-seed, proceed model. And this is more of a process sort of model of how you do implementation. So the pre-seed, come on in, everybody's trying it. The pre-seed are the predisposing, reinforcing, and enabling factors. And you can forget the educational diagnosis and evaluation, that's the same. But the pre-seed are, so you talk about predisposing factors, reinforcing, and enabling factors in a given setting, right? So if you look again at, you know, you want your intervention to be exercise in cancer patients undergoing treatment, right? So what's the setting you want to work in? What are the predisposing factors for and against sort of implementing this, right? Well, there's no exercise facility at the cancer center, right? So can we put in an exercise facility, or do we get patients to go into the community, or do we provide them with things? You know, so what are all the sort of things that are in place? And then what about the policy, regulatory, and organizational constructs that are there? So pre-seed, proceed. So it's a process model that offers a detailed process for program planning and evaluation.
It considers the impact of both the organizational level and the environment that you're working in. And you'll see with all these implementation things, it's complicated because it's not just up to you as the person trying to do it, the implementation, it's all about the environment, right? And having to engage all the stakeholders. And again, you know, we talked about the complexity of understanding who the decision makers are in these environments, right? And who holds the purse strings and the authority to make decisions around changes in practice. So this model is most useful when planning an intervention and includes evaluative components. And it analyzes each step. So I was becoming confused with all these models, and then I found this website. Get it? So this is called Dissemination and Implementation Models in Health Research and Practice. And it has this like amazing thing, this table of all the models that they have gathered together. And it looks at the model, and it looks at whether it's for dissemination or implementation. It rates how flexible it is, and it defines it, let's see, on a 1.5 scale, with broad meaning loosely outlined, allowing for flexibility, and 5 being very detailed with step-by-step actions. And then whether it works at the level of an industry, an organization, a community, a system, or policy. And where it came from, so aging and mental health, nursing, you know, where it's mostly been applied. This is interesting too, the number of times the model's been cited in the literature, so you can see which ones are most popular. And then if it had been rated by, I think, users, there's ratings there, right? So it's alphabetical, and you can just look at some of these, like, let's look at some that have lots of citations. So active implementation framework, right? And then there's a little description of it here. So it's got all these different constructs: adoption, awareness, barriers, communication channels, evaluation, fidelity. This looks actually quite good. Implementation, innovation characteristics. So it's got maintenance in it, pre-implementation. So what does it say here? Oh, interesting. So if you look up, you click on the construct, it tells you which models include that construct. And it's got references for citations and examples of people applying the model. So if we go back, let's see if we recognize any of these. One that's got 1,050 citations. Oh, look, the CIHR knowledge translation within the knowledge action model, the research cycle. So that's the one we've been studying the most. It's also one of the most popular ones, so with 1,000 different citations. So that's one you should know. Maybe this active implementation framework, we haven't looked at that. That might be something to investigate. Let's see what else. So this one here, community-based participatory research. So that would be more specific to people who are trying to engage within the community. It's participatory action research, so it's very patient-oriented. That's the kind of thing that the PACER program has been doing. In fact, I think that's what it stands for. So that's obviously really popular, right? And this one here, conceptual model for the diffusion of innovations in service organizations. And again, it's got here, it tells you this is more about dissemination than implementation, and the areas that can be used. And we're only on the C's here, people. Like it's unbelievable. Coordinated implementation model, never heard of that. Here's one with 330. Oh, look at this. 39,000.
Agriculture.
Yeah, so what's that? Diffusion of innovation in agriculture. It's dissemination only, it says. So what does it do? It talks about compatibility, I guess, of the message, I don't know, complexity, trialability, observability, and relative advantage. I don't know about that one, so that's maybe one we need to look into. And I only discovered this website when I was finishing up making the presentations. I was like, oh, I gotta look at some of these models. So diffusion of innovation, and whether it's relevant to an area like healthcare, we don't know. But actually this one here, one means it's very broad, right? So it probably would be adaptable. And let's see what else is big numbers here. Here's one with 830. Implementation effectiveness model. This is only implementation. It's been applied in management. So this probably is a way to measure. Oh yes, barriers and facilitators, we've seen that, right? Decision maker characteristics. So this one looks like it might help you plan something. So this is similar to the action cycle, right? Barriers, facilitators, communication, context, fit. Interesting. Let's see what else we got here. Knowledge transfer and exchange, a little bit popular. Multi-level conceptual framework of organizational innovation adoption. Well, we made it to the M's. Oh, Paris. Sound familiar? Does anybody remember Paris? We did do this one. We did this one in knowledge translation because it's a health services model that's quite popular. So the Paris model, and see if it describes it. So this is just summarizing the constructs that they have created, I think, and which ones fall in each model. But we can always go back and look at the Paris slides. Oh, here's REAIM. There we go. REAIM is fairly popular public health model. And this one is a similar, dissemination and implementation, real-world dissemination. I don't know that one, so that's another one you could look at. Here's one with lots, 4377, sticky knowledge from management and medicine. Oh, here's a big one, streams of policy process from political science. And that's all. Just a few, okay? So I think if you were to actually want to put together an implementation project, you'd want to frame it around one of these frameworks and use it to structure your intervention. So I thought that was cool. Oh, and now we're going to talk about, so that was implementation, right? The whole process of implementation. But then within implementation is implementation science, right? Which is actually researching methods of implementation, which I find more interesting, although I don't know how interesting you find this guy, but he will define it. There's two videos here. The first one is he talks about what implementation research is, and then he'll give some more examples.
Really, I do have to say that there are two views of this.
Is that loud enough?
One view of implementation research is about how proven effective practices are implemented effectively. So that takes an evidence-based treatment or practice and it looks at effective ways to implement that. Another area of implementation research is to study how people take up an idea or an evidence-based practice or a new innovation and how they adapt it and reinvent it in order to fit their organisation or patient group. So what I'm contrasting there is almost two different fields within implementation research. One is fidelity implementation. Did they copy exactly, and if not, why not? And the other area is adaptive implementation studies, which is how and why did they change this original idea to suit their situation.
That's interesting. Does that, when he talks about studies looking at what happens when they take an evidence-based treatment and, apply it in a certain setting, does that ring bells for anyone? Anything we talked about?
Generalizability and effectiveness?
Yeah, so remember we talked about the continuum from efficacy to effectiveness, or from, what's it called, explanatory to pragmatic, right? So he's talking about, you've got your efficacy trial that shows that exercise improves fatigue, or whatever it is, right? But then what happens when you put it in the real world, right? So he seems to be talking about just studying carefully a sort of naturalistic observation of what happens, but you can also design a pragmatic trial
to move this thing into the real world using the way things work in the real world and measure how effective it is, right? So that would be an example of implementation research. So say we're doing it right now with acupuncture. So we've done a study that was very controlled with patients who only patients who have pain, right? And they get a set number of sessions. They get 12 sessions over the course of 6 weeks. And now we're talking about making it a clinical program. And so the question is, well, would we restrict it to patients with pain? Well, probably not, right? Would we make sure they all had 12 sessions? Well, probably not, right? Because they might not all need 12 sessions. Would we take people who had different problems, right? Because, we could use it for hot flushes or nausea or xerostomia or whatever, right? And would we take any types of cancer patients? And so we're saying, okay, we should broaden it, but then wait, how do we know it's still effective, right? Because all we've studied is that it works for patients with pain when you give it in this way. So if we're going to then offer it as a clinical program and make all these adaptations in the implementation, how do we know it's still going to work? So we need to design a form of pragmatic research around that, right? So that would be implementation research. So it's very similar to the whole real-world pragmatic clinical trials that we talked about, a few classes back. So all this stuff circles back and links in, I think, as we talk about these ideas: knowledge translation, implementation, dissemination, patient-oriented research. They're all very highly integrated, right? So now he's going to talk about, there we go, about the importance of doing this research.
Really, I do have to say that there are two views of this. One view of implementation research is about how proven effective practices
Wait, we already did this.
are implemented.
Okay, I thought we were on the next one. Well, where's the other one? I thought there was two. Hold on. I know I've got two, and I think they're, Oh, definition. Oh, no. Did I put the same video in twice? Ooh. That's the same video, isn't it? Okay, let's find the other one. Let's see. Where's this dude? No, can't find him. Where is he? There he is. Okay, that's the one we just saw, but his other one should pop up next to it. It's this one here.
There is some research that can make a big difference for patients and carers, and can also improve the work situation of many of our clinical colleagues who are often having a bad time with these changes in the cuts to budgets. So there is some research that can help make things better for people. I think there is an important field for health research, which is about how do we enable patients and providers to take up more effective ways to achieve what they want to achieve. And this isn't about machine implementation. It's about understanding the life space of patients and also understanding the workflows of workspace of professionals, and knowing why they may very much want to use this new way of doing things, but it's impossible or very difficult for them to use it, even if they know. And simply telling them that there is a more effective way and they really should do this, and it is simply making them feel bad about their work being less effective than it should otherwise be, and not really helping them. I think a lot of researchers fail to understand the real everyday life situation of patients and providers, and what would enable them to take up more effective ways, and is deafeningly silent in the reality of adopting and taking up better ways to do something in the real life change thing. So that's why I think implementation research is extremely important. Another way to put it is, a lot of people know about the translational pathway, the T1, T2, and from bench to bedside. The way we explain it to our folks at the Karolinska and others, the sort of the high-end pure researchers, is we're dealing with the dark end about how more patients more quickly can benefit from this more effective treatment, and that's about implementation. And there is a science and theories and ways to study what helps and hinders ordinary practitioners and ordinary patients from benefiting from the new approach that you've developed. Another simple way to put it is we can improve the effectiveness of a medication by about 10%. We spend billions of dollars trying to do that. But if you look at real life and patients' adherence to medications, for me that's the really important bit of implementation, is whether patients follow the lifestyle change with the medication and what helps and hinders them in their everyday lives and adhering to medications. And that's implementation. Another way to put it is, I had a hip operation. I'm a professor of health service research and a scientist, and I've done this for 35 years. I should know that if I don't take painkillers, it's going to hurt. But frequently, 6 or 8 hours later, I thought, my God, this is hurting. Well, of course, dummy, you haven't taken the painkiller. And it's as simple as that. It's pretty direct feedback. So what hope for someone who's taking preventative medication, trying to avoid a heart attack or stroke, where you really just don't, it's sort of, oh my goodness, it's been 3 days since I took my medications, oh, I better take them all at once. So adherence, simple things like adherence, is, for me, implementation research.
So that struck me, this idea of adherence. So who can think of some examples of problems to adherence in the kind of work we do?
Not meeting recommended guidelines, keeping falling off.
Yeah, so for exercise, right?
Yeah.
Like how many people don't even know they should exercise, it's good for them. What's the proportion that they're not adherent? Like, do you even know that? I'm sure there's data out there. It's probably like 80% of people, just in general, and then when we look at patients, it's probably even higher, right? So finding ways to help people and systems do what they want to do, or they know they should be doing, is really important. I mean, and Kirsty, you can think of lots of examples, I'm sure.
I'm even thinking about how it's not binary too. Like with the mindfulness program, people might show up every session, but then not do the homework, or not do all of the homework, or do the homework half-heartedly too. So there can be lots of different ways that they may or may not do it.
And if you're trying to get a oncologist to remind every patient to exercise or take their medication, how often do they forget, right? Even though they know it's important and they want to give that advice to their patients, right? And Kirsty's PhD is women who don't take their anti-estrogen drugs after breast cancer, right? I mean, it's exactly like he said. You don't feel bad. There's no reminder that you need to take it. It's a preventative kind of thing. And on top of that, it can also have negative side effects, right? Like if it's just a statin, like a heart medication, you don't notice it one way or the other. It doesn't make you feel bad. It just doesn't make you feel good either, right? So it's easy to forget. So really, you know, the evidence, the efficacy trials are showing that that medication helps prevent recurrence of your disease, showing that exercise improves your survival outcomes. That's efficacy research. But implementation research is, how do you get people to do it? How do you get health systems to change? And how do you get them to stay, right? So those questions in my mind are actually more important. You know, I mean, it's interesting to do the other research, but what's going to make the biggest difference is this.
What I find interesting is how everyone keeps trying like education interventions. And it's like, well, so it's based on the assumption that people don't know that this is good for them, but it's like, well, people, sure, maybe some people don't, but a lot of people do, and it's still not enough, but they still, that's mostly what I see as education.
Yeah, and it's ill-informed, right? People don't understand human behavior, right? And these interventions have to be much more complex. In the smoking, I used to run smoking cessation groups for many years. Those smokers know they need to quit.
Yeah.
That's not the problem, right? You know, not in any way is that the problem, but you have to actually give them concrete tools and tips and suggestions and stuff that they can do based on, again, research of what works and what doesn't. Right? And then if we go way back to the orbit model of research, how do you know which components and elements work and don't work? Well, that you do that kind of research by combining them and separating them and testing them, you know, and then you come out with that knowledge product, right, which is your guideline. And then you've got the problem of getting people to follow it once you know what it is. Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, what do we get here? Oh, I'm still in that. Okay. This dude. Let's see, so what do we have next? Oh, okay. So another paper that I put in your D2L is this implementation science models, which I actually came to at the end. I thought it was helpful to make sense of all that big giant list of models, right, that was on the website. There was probably, I didn't count them, there must have been 200 of them there, right? And so the models can be broken into kind of categories, like, so there's process models, right? And then here it gives you examples of some of the models. Like, for example, Paris is in here as a framework of determinants or domains, right? And process models are things that specify steps or stages or phases in the process of translating research to practice, right? So to me, those seem like they would be most helpful for people designing research is, okay, do this stage and that stage and then the next thing. So including implementation and use of research. So the aim here is to describe and guide the process of translating research into practice. An action model is a type of process model that provides practical guidance. The terms model and framework are both used, but the former appears to be the most common. So these are some, here's the knowledge to action model. There it is again, right? The Ottawa model, and we did talk about that a couple of classes ago. I showed it to you, that one. So there's all sorts of different process models, and I think if you're, there's the CIHR model of knowledge translation. I think that refers to the 5 KT intervention points, and then the knowledge to action, it isn't actually a CIHR model, but CIHR uses it. So those are all process models, and they can help you with the steps, and I think are most useful. These other category of determinant frameworks, so let's see, classes or domains of determinants and individual determinants. So this is about barriers and enablers in the environment that you're working with. Let's see, are independent variables that influence implementation outcomes. So these barriers and enablers, you know, I'm too busy, there's not enough time, or whatever, you know, these kind of barriers that are identified. In the healthcare system, it's often those types of barriers. You know, I have a process that I follow, trying to change that is like too difficult, or there's not enough time, or, you know, nobody wants to do this, those kind of things. Some frameworks also specify relationships between determinants. The aim is to understand or explain influences on implementation outcomes. So trying to predict outcomes based on different barriers and things like that. So these are some examples. The Paris one, I think re-aim might be in here. I think re-aim is actually an evaluation framework. Yeah, so re-aim and precede, proceed that come up under the sort of dissemination implementation are more evaluation frameworks. Not as much process models about how to do it. Classic theories, they originate from fields external to implementation science. So psychology, sociology, you know, IO, they can be applied to understand aspects of implementation. So there's this, you know, social cognition theory. So psychologists in the crowd, there's a couple, you know, will be familiar with these. I don't know the theory of diffusion, mind you. Have you heard of that?
That one's not the
No.
only one I recognize is social cognitive theory.
Yeah. Yeah, cognitive processes, decision making, social network, social capital, communities practice. I'm familiar with all those things to a certain extent. Implementation theories developed by implementation researchers from scratch or by adapting things. So none of these I've really heard. Organizational readiness you hear about sometimes, and so there's like questionnaires that you can, or processes you can like assess your own organization and how ready it is to implement this change, and if it's almost like the stages of change idea, like if it's really not ready at all, you have to work on that, and if it's ready but just needs instruction, then you work on that level. So you assess organizational readiness and try to move them along. And then there's evaluation frameworks. So this article, the Nielsen one, was really useful. I can show it to you. Making sense of implementation theories, models, and frameworks. And it goes through, actually, does this one go through them all? Yeah, the process models, and talks about each of those. So it sort of gives you an aim of research. So this is useful if you're, sort of trying to understand the area a bit more. I found this to be a pretty good one. I don't know if it goes through. Oh yeah, it does too. 8 determinant frameworks. So that's a good one to read. And I think that's it for today in terms of content. So in summary, we found that dissemination is really one part of the knowledge translation process. Implementation is really also part of knowledge translation, although you could focus in on either one of these areas, as your major area of study. And implementation science is the formal study of the implementation part of the process. Many, many models exist to guide both the development and evaluation of implementation programs. There's lots of things out there to choose from, but you really should be guided by a model if you're trying to sort of plan a study that's around implementation. Choose a model that makes sense to you or fits your situation and use that as a guide. So next time we're going to do scalability and sustainability. So scalability, bringing interventions to larger groups of people. Again, that's another part of the implementation process. And sustainability is this idea of keeping things going once they're implemented. And again, this fits in within the whole KT thing. And then just for fun, we'll do a little social media tutorial. I don't know, how many people are on Twitter? 1, 2, you're on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter.
Are you following me?
No. I will. Wow.
I know Davish is. Christine, did you say you're on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter.
Oh, you're not on Twitter. Okay, so you are, yeah. Anyway, we'll do Twitter. Everyone's pretty familiar with Facebook. The main ones used in academia really are Twitter, LinkedIn, the more boring way. There's ResearchGate and stuff like that. Do people use ResearchGate?
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
I mean, I have an account.
Yeah. I don't account you're not going to anyway, don't talk about
So I have a Twitter account as well, but I don't know.
But we can have some fun. We'll do some live tweeting and stuff like that. So let's go back though to where we are, the dissemination implementation. So are there any sort of discussion, comments around all this stuff? I bet your heads are just swimming, right?
I remember briefly looking into implementation science, and I'm wondering if if there's any kind of well-established tips that have kind of already been kind of considered foundational. I feel like I've come across things like you need to have buy-in from supervisors and things like that. So I wonder if you know off the top of your head any of these generally accepted things that the field has already shown.
Yeah, well, there's lots of stuff I've read about sort of barriers and enablers and stuff like that, and that falls within the knowledge to action cycle. Mm-hmm. That's one of the boxes in the action cycle. Mm-hmm. And there's also quality improvement sort of literature that they've used. For example, implementing screening for distress in Alberta Health Services. There's, I can't remember what it's called, but it's this feedback. There's a name for it. It'll probably come to me. Where you're kind of doing audit. Oh, audit and feedback, I think it's called.
Okay.
right? So you're trying to implement something, you give people a month or so, you do an audit on how well they're doing, and then you give them feedback. And you know, there's methods where you can say compare the Tom Baker to the Cross, and you show them the data, right? So they've done that with the screening, and there's actually 17 different centers throughout Alberta. So they, once it was in all the centers, they would compile the data on percentage of patients screened, you know, and show graphs and compare and say, okay, you're at 85, which is good, but these guys are doing 92, right? And you're, you know, you guys are only doing 50, like, come on, right? So that's called audit and feedback.
And instead of just doing that, improve the effectiveness?
Well, I think people have studied it. I'm actually not sure if it's shown to, but it's a well-known sort of process. But, you know, if you look at, like, a good example is from Screening for Distress, because it's been implemented across Canada. And so the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer has come up with very specific materials on how to implement, and those are on the CPAC website, because they've done it in Ontario, they've done it in Alberta, it's sort of happening in lots of places. And so through the process of doing that, they learned a lot about just different methods that may or may not be helpful. But again, at the same time, I don't know how well they scientifically studied the impact of the different methods. But I think going with one of those frameworks, you know, like a process framework, like in this thing here, right? Some of those models that are listed there, I would go, you know, what would be useful is to go to that website that listed them all, right? Look up some of these ones and see some of the references that they cite about, because a lot of the references are examples where it's been applied and stuff like that, right? So if you're actually looking for one, I mean, the most obvious one is the knowledge to action thing, but it might not be appropriate for everything. Yeah, but definitely that, you know, in the knowledge to action, it has the assessment of enablers and barriers and then plans to overcome them, right? And, it, you know, the papers that talk about that model go more in depth.
Specific, concrete examples
Yeah.
of strategies.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, for dissemination, Linda, like, have you used local news channels for dissemination?
Yeah. Yeah, we've done a lot of, you know, whenever something gets published is a good opportunity for a media release. So we've done it in a couple of circumstances. So with the LIGHT study, we did a big media release when we were recruiting. And there was probably 5 or 6, you know, it was like we were on CBC, you know, on the radio, on the like global news, CTV, all that, right? So if they pick it up, and I've got a list of all of them, it's in my CV, Pam's updating, but you know, we've got a list of all those. And for example, when the Mindset study was published, that was comparing mindfulness and supportive expressive therapy, there was lots of research that was, or lots of media outlets that picked it up. And when we did the telomere study, there was like hundreds of them who picked that up, you know, in different outlets. Actually, I should show you my favorite one, if I can find it.
Is it the one with the blonde woman on the cover?
Oh, no.
Oh.
That one's funny too, though. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. I just love the headline. Isn't that hilarious?
Yeah.
Scientific American, nonetheless. Isn't that hilarious?
MK Ultra or something.
Yeah. No, this was our study, right? I mean, you can't control what the media says about your stuff, right? I think, therefore I am is perhaps the most familiar one-liner in Western philosophy. Even if the stoners, philosophers, and quantum mechanically inclined skeptics who believe we're living an illusion are right, few existential quips hit with such profound, appropriate simplicity. The only catch is that in Descartes' opinion, we, our thoughts, our possibilities, our minds are mostly divorced from our bodies. Blah, blah, blah. And then it gets down to, what do they say actually? It's actually quite a clever article. While the mind exerts control over our physical interaction with the world, there's a clear delineation between body and mind. Our material forms are simply temporary housing for our immaterial souls. Centuries of science argue against a corporeal crash pad. Body and mind appear inextricably linked. Findings from a new study published in Cancer by a Canadian group suggest that our mental state has measurable physical influence on us, more specifically on our DNA. The investigator, blah, 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 found in breast cancer patients support group involvement in mindfulness meditation, blah, 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 associated with preserved telomere length. You know, so, you know, that's how they made sense of this, right? And there was tons of, that was the funniest one.
So yeah, that particular study got like a ton of media coverage, right? But you know, I don't know if that's super important, really. You know, I mean, maybe for getting people to think, oh, maybe I should try that.
Or funders.
What's that?
Or funders.
Funders, yeah, I suppose. Any other questions?
I wonder if like, is this sort of thing more effective for getting like more creative alternative sources of funding, like when you go to private foundations or something, as opposed to traditional?
Probably.
CIHR,
I've never
like
actually really tried too much through alternative funders. I mean, the Hecht Foundation, who funds the match study, is a private foundation, but they're very conservative, kind of, you know, they're not a very flashy group. Like I don't think they'd be impressed
So
by
this
stuff like this.
them.
Well, and I would never present something like this to them, right? Like it's not, I don't know, I guess if it was Oprah, Deepak, you're going to maybe, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that's another area too, is how do you fund your research, right? You need to get creative, and most of us are not very creative. We just look at CIHR and we look at the traditional venues, and it's really hard to get, research that's not super mainstream. I mean, the beauty is that CIHR loves patient-oriented research, right? So there's lots of opportunity there. Any other questions, comments? We should take a photo. Can you take it?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Pam, behind the scenes.
Always.
Behind the camera.